when you have that platform, that world stage, the camera's on you and you say those kinds of things, even if it's not true, by the time you make a retraction or an apology, it's already beamed across the world and it's too late at that point. It's an uphill battle, to say the least, and especially since October the 7th.
3 years ago, an Iranian woman named Mahsa Amini was arrested and killed by the morality police in Iran, sparking outrage and protests throughout the country. Today we sit down with Jonathan Harounoff, a British Israeli author of Persian descent and the international spokesperson for Israel at the UN. We discuss his new book Unveiled, which delves deeper into the issue. Okay, Jonathan, welcome to the show.
Great to be with you, Shifra.
It's a pleasure to have you. Before we get started, I just want to ask you a little bit about your background. Maybe tell me a little bit about yourself and how you got into the position that you're in today.
Sure. I was born and raised in the UK. I was there for most of my life, and about 8 years ago I moved to the United States with my now wife for graduate study, and we stayed for work. I spent a few years in corporate communications and journalism, where I was covering Israel, Iran, anti-Semitism for a variety of publications, writing also for the Jerusalem Post. And then I started writing this book. And while I was covering many things related to Iran and Israel, one event that I was covering was at the UN. It was around the time, a few months after October the 7th had taken place, and the Israeli mission to the UN was holding an exclusive screening of the 47-minute Hamas atrocities footage, and wrote about it. It got a bit of attention. It caught the eye of the previous ambassador. We started talking, and I was very fortunate enough to have this position with the current ambassador at the Israeli mission, and very grateful. It's an honor of a lifetime.
Can you go into a little bit about what your role is now?
Currently serve as the international spokesperson at the Israeli mission to the UN, which involves working a lot with the media, being both reactive and proactive whenever there's any news concerning Israel and the UN. So that could involve anything from press conferences to requests for comments to demanding, like asking for retractions if there are any inaccuracies, to facilitating, high-level visitors, writing articles. It's basically the other end of the communication spectrum that I was so used to as a journalist. And I think that background as a journalist really helps you become, I think, a more well-rounded spokesperson, because you know the needs of the journalist and you know how to work with them in an effective and timely manner.
Can we delve into a little bit about what that looks like today? Because I know that in general, even before the war began, even before October 7th, the UN and Israel, there's always sort of things going on. What does it look like today when there's so much from so many different sides, so many different things that are being written, so many things that people are saying? How does that look for you as somebody who's sort of on the inside?
It's an uphill battle, to say the least, and especially since October the 7th, we spend a lot of days inside the UN, the Security Council, the General Assembly, because there are so many sessions that are being called. But it's sort of an alternative reality inside the UN, where there's so much focus on demonizing, on lambasting, on telling off Israel for its actions, and there's very little focus on sort of the instigators of this conflict, who brought it about to begin with. Very little conversation on Hamas, on the hostages. You had very few sessions on that. A few weeks ago, we had like one of the first historic sessions where the foreign minister of Israel came to the UN Security Council, and that session was primarily focused on the plight of the hostages. But up until that point, there was very little conversation about it, and we've seen very little tangible action by the UN actually demanding the release of these hostages, formally condemning Hamas. They seem to be much more focused, almost myopically focused, on demonizing Israel, and certain senior officials seem to do the same. And when you have that platform, that world stage, the camera's on you and you say those kinds of things, even if it's not true, by the time you make a retraction or an apology, it's already beamed across the world and it's too late at that point.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think that's sort of the situation that we're currently in, where the focus is not necessarily on, or there's not like an equal focus, I would say, on the suffering of specific people?
It's I don't know is the reality. I don't know why people don't, why there's a sort of historical amnesia that you see take place inside the UN, and not just the UN, but in global media, where there seems to be sort of people forgetting how this conflict began, why it's here, who started this conflict, the fact that Israel didn't initiate this at all on October the 7th, and that everything that you've seen up until this point has been a reaction to the conflict, to the October 7th, whether it was fighting Hamas, Hezbollah, um, Syrians, Lebanese, the Islamic Republic of Iran. This all boils down to one very, very dark day on the happiest day of the Jewish calendar, Simchat Torah, and there's very little focus on that.
Speaking of Iran, you have Jewish Iranian heritage. How has that sort of shaped where you are in your career? Because before you said as well, as a journalist as well, you worked on it too.
I've always been fascinated by um, the Persian language, Persian culture, Persian food. My family make amazing food, so I grew up with the languages, the food, the smells, the carpets, the art, and also the Hebrew language, Israeli food, Israeli culture, and those kinds of sort of cultures and worlds you would think collide and clash. So I always was curious, why is there so much tension between these two nations? Because if you think about it, Iran and Israel are probably two cultural anomalies in the Middle East. Israel, of course, for self-explanatory reasons, but if you look at Iran, it's got its own, very protective over its own culture, its own language for years. It's a predominantly Shiite nation in a sea of Sunni countries. 85 to 90% of the world's Muslims are Sunni, and you've got then the Islamic Republic of Iran, this one country in a sea of Sunni nations. So you would think that Israel and Iran would have some kind of affinity just because of them being anomalies, but that's absolutely not the case since 1979, where you've seen this Islamic Republic, this fundamentalist regime, come into power, and right from its very inception, it's had a vehemently anti-Israel, anti-Western, anti-capitalist, anti-American ideology, and it's caused a lot of instability in the Middle East. And it's one of the focuses that I've had in my book and in my writing, that the reason why so many people inside Iran are so upset, there's so much unrest, is because they've come to the realization that their Islamic Republic is not doing enough to care about the people of Iran, is not investing in their future, in their social, economic well-being, but is investing hundreds and hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars in constructing a very dangerous foreign policy, building very dangerous, expensive nuclear weapons, developing this web of proxies. And, all of that costs money, takes resources, time, and it's all being diverted away from the people of Iran, which is why you see so much unrest there.
For me, it was very interesting during the 12-day war, when I was sort of online and looking at different things, seeing the responses of people who live in Iran who are just on social media. And that was like the first time that I felt that we had this sort of connection and maybe, like, as you said, like affinity sort of towards one another, because at the end of the day, it's just people who want to live their lives and to grow and to have the opportunity to do so. And there's almost like no opportunities for the Iranian people and the Israeli people to really connect and talk, because the governments are so, I would say, not sort of taking that path of having the conversation together. So I found that like really interesting.
And you saw other extraordinary instances of this kind of potential allyship at the beginning of the Women Life Freedom movement in September 2022, when women were cutting their hair, setting their veils on fire, and protesting in general inside Iran. One of the first groups to pledge support and solidarity with the women of Iran were Israelis inside Israel and abroad, and Jewish people abroad. They were posting on social media, and it was quite an extraordinary thing to see. And also, October the 7th, immediately after, one of the first diaspora groups to pledge very widespread solidarity with the people of Israel were Iranian non-Jewish people in the diaspora, because they understand the sort of suffering that Israelis had faced, because Israelis suffered, on that day at the hands of a Tehran-backed proxy, and nobody has suffered more at the hands of the Islamic Republic than the people of Iran for the past 46 years.
I'd love to sort of move on to talking about your book and sort of ask you how I guess if you give us some background on what happened and how the protests began, but also how it affected you and what made you sort of move towards writing the book.
Its origins were, I spent about 3 years writing the book, and even though it's a small book, I kept it small because I think the story of the Iranian people and their future is still very much unfolding. But it involved dozens of interviews with Iranian sources that I had cultivated on the ground and also in the diaspora in the 7 or so years that I was reporting as a journalist. And I spoke to them about what they want the future of Iran to look like, how they've suffered, their backgrounds. So, for anyone who's not aware about how the Women Life Freedom Uprising began, it very much began with a very small, seemingly small episode that really metamorphosized and accumulated into a massive uprising on September the 13th, 2022. A young Iranian Kurdish 22-year-old woman named Mahsa Amini, who comes from the Kurdish part of Iran, was traveling to Tehran with her relatives. She was about to start studies at university, and she was shopping. She was just on a vacation, a holiday. And as she left the metro station in Tehran, she was stopped by the country's morality police. And this force has been in power since 2005, 2006, and one of their main roles is to uphold the country's very strict draconian dress codes. And they claim that she was dressed inappropriately, even though she did have her head covered and she was dressed fairly modestly by the Islamic Republic standards. She was arrested, taken to a re education center, and she was beaten there to a pulp. She fell into a coma, uh, was declared brain dead, and 3 days later, on September the 16th, she died. And um, very few, because the situation, the journalism is not as you would see here in Israel or elsewhere. It's very extremely restricted, but there were a few independent journalists who were able to get into the hospital where Masa Amini had died, and they got some extraordinary pictures, and I spoke to a few of them in the book. They got one extraordinary picture of Amini's relatives hugging each other after they found out that she died. And as the news spread, both by journalists inside Iran and abroad, uh, there was outcry, there was shock, and massive protests started to take place inside Iran across almost all 31 provinces and abroad as well. And it eventually led to this massive movement of women ripping off their headscarves, setting it on fire, chanting these slogans. And these were simple slogans that people just they had had enough of a regime that had been waging war on women for 46 years, and they wanted to fight back. And I think one of the reasons why this movement and the death of this woman really resonated with so many Iranian women was because she was a very ordinary woman. She wasn't a politician, an activist, a protester trying to get attention. She was minding her own business. And I think the reason why she was, because of how ordinary she was in that sense, it resonated with Iranian women because it could have happened to any of them. And it did happen to many of them. Many of them had been accosted and arrested and chastised by the morality police. And I think that really helped amplify the movement. And then we saw in the main halls of power in the world, we saw it in Downing Street, White House, the UN, and elsewhere, these expressions of solidarity and support. And unfortunately, eventually, the movement didn't, sort of ended up fizzling out, and those expressions of support weren't followed by tangible actions. But it was an extraordinary movement in many senses, and it did have some successes. But for the people of Iran, they didn't succeed in their ultimate goal of actually toppling the Islamic Republic.
I remember seeing the footage when it first came out, especially of the protests and people kind of standing on cars, taking off their hijab, setting fire to the hijab. Um, to me, it was just such a powerful, brave. I mean, I can't even imagine knowing that you maybe don't have the chance to express yourself. It might not be legal to express yourself in that way, and saying, I've had enough. I want to fight for my rights and I'm going to do it. And it was one of the most powerful things I think I've seen in a very, very long time. And I felt just that, I was affected by it in a way that, as a woman, you kind of look at it and you think, okay, wow, what privilege we have, I guess, like where I live or where other people live. You don't always notice or hear about, especially as you said, it's more restricted. I don't think I even realized how how restrictive the lifestyle was and what that even meant. And unfortunately, as you said, the movement had to sort of fizzle out. But I think the fact that it even happened in the first place is something that, will remain kind of etched in a lot of people's memories.
And it was an extraordinary movement for those very reasons you mentioned, because pretty much everyone who took part knew the risks involved. There had been many bouts of unrest before where people faced severe consequences. You just look at 2009 with the Green Revolution. At the time, there was a disputed presidential election, re-election of the incumbent Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, and many people were hopeful that his rival, Musavi, would be elected, but he ended up not being elected, and he ended up losing significantly, and people thought that the whole election was rigged. Hundreds of thousands of people stormed the streets, and there was mass unrest was met with unrelenting violence. And you've seen through that many cases of the Islamic Republic and the IRGC responding in force. So these women who were defenseless were just storming the streets peacefully, and chanting, were knew the costs involved and were unbelievably brave to do so.
If we sort of try and move that into today, there was that feeling of unrest. It almost seems like it's a pattern where something happens, there's a feeling of unrest, the people rise up, and then there's not, I don't know how I would word it specifically, but there isn't a clear way to follow through in order for the regime to fall. And I'm wondering, I guess, from your perspective, how you think that maybe could happen. Are we closer to sort of a regime change in Iran, or?
I think one first and foremost, it's I don't think I think some people underestimate the might and the resolve and the resilience of the Islamic Republic. It itself came about as a result of a revolution, and since then it knows how a revolution comes about, and it knows also what it takes to quell one. Um, so at the beginning, like immediately after the 12-day war, when there were like these observers saying that the regime is about to fall and everything was about, it was hanging by a thread. I don't know if that's accurate, because and also the expectations that the people of Iran were immediately going to rise up. I also don't think that was a sort of fair expectation on the people of Iran, because their government wasn't caring for them when their country was at a state of war. They weren't providing shelters and warnings and all of that the same way Israel does. So those people, they can't mobilize at that time. They have to fend for themselves, leave the city centers, and they will find their own time, and they have found their own time to rise up, and they've done that time and time again. And it usually coincides when the Islamic Republic is at a time of weakness, and when the country is facing severe domestic challenges. And at the moment, there are severe water shortages, there are droughts in almost all of the country's provinces. In the city centre, Tehran, there's major water shortages. The president and a few other senior ministers have said that the country is on the brink of running out of water and really severely being in trouble. And like imagine Iran wasn't at a state of war with Israel. Imagine the Islamic Republic wasn't there, and there was a country that actually wanted peace and stability. And imagine the kind of collaboration that you could have with a country like Israel and water technology and all of that stuff to sort of combat these issues. But it's very clear that a regime like this has no interest in that kind of allyship. If anything, it just seems hell bent on Israel's destruction, and has no interest in improving the lives of its own people.
What would you say was the most important takeaway that you had from writing the book and interviewing people who were so associated with the issue?
I think it's a very important but simple misconception to address. The fact, I think some people even today assume that the people of Iran, the 90 plus million people of Iran, and the Islamic Republic of Iran, the clerical leadership, the military infrastructure, they all have identical views of the world and of what they want for Iran. And I think in the process of writing this book, it became very clear that that couldn't be further from the truth, that the people of Iran do not share the Islamic Republic's views. They aren't they aren't anti-Western, anti-Israel, anti-American. They do want a better future for themselves, uh, like most other ordinary people. And I think that's one of the key takeaways, that the people of Iran are not the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Okay, so let's move back a little bit into your role in the UN. Have you felt that you've sort of faced any hostility from other delegations? And just people that you've worked with, especially because it's quite a contentious time to be connected to Israel?
These are very tense times, and you do sense some hostility. But I think there are some bright spots, and that aren't spoken about enough. There are staff members inside the UN, and there are other member states that they may not necessarily say in public, but they do understand Israel's position and why it's doing what it is doing. And I've had, and many other of my colleagues have had instances where you would walk past someone in the hallway of the UN. They would stop you and they would like look around themselves and they would say like, "We're with you." And it sounds very like bizarre to hear that at the UN. And that's not to say that isn't plenty of hostility, but I think you also have those kinds of anecdotes that are very uplifting and that do sort of reassure you that you are on the right path and that you are doing what's right.
Have there been specific challenges that you've faced? I mean, I'm sure there have been, and if there are, what have they been?
There are many challenges. Like on the media front, there are many inaccuracies and issues that have to be resolved on a regular basis, fires that have to be put out. But I think the fact that there's so little focus and attention on the plight of the hostages, and so little attention on Hamas, that can be that's very challenging, and that's why the Israeli mission and its partners, including the US, um, spend a lot of time amplifying the voices of recently released hostages, bringing them to the United Nations Security Council. People like extraordinary individuals like Eli Sharabi, who was just at the UN Security Council, speaking to the ambassadors and telling them his story from his mouth, and other people, even before October 7th, for example, Leah Golding, the mother of Hadar Golding, um, to really highlight the fact that hostage taking didn't just begin on October the 7th. Her son, Hadar, has been held captive for more than 10 years. And this is straight out this kind of hostage diplomacy, hostage taking, uh, bargaining is really straight out of the Islamic Republic's playbook because at their very inception, we had the US embassy hostage crisis where more than 50 US embassy staff were taken hostage for 444 days. And since then, you've seen the Islamic Republic take foreign nationals hostage because it's a very lucrative business. And they know that many of those Western governments that care about their people will go to great lengths to release them.
Do you think because of these personal stories, and I guess because there's more of this push now for recognition for the hostages and also to condemn the sort of hostage taking method, do you see that there's maybe going to be a shift in how the UN responds to these kinds of things, or how does that look?
We will continue to raise their voices. Those who are not around, not unable to, and those who are, will continue to amplify their voices. People like uh, Eli David as well, from a few weeks back. Uh, but I don't know if we're sensing a shift, but we'll do whatever is necessary to ensure that they're not forgotten, even if some member states try to move on move on to other things like talking about Palestinian recognition and these kinds of rewards where the crux of the issue hasn't been resolved yet.
Let's move on to something a little bit more positive. I know you made headlines recently because of your wedding. Congratulations, first of all.
Thank you.
Second of all, you had your wedding in Jesus College at Cambridge, right? And that was the first Jewish wedding, I think, ever that they had there, right?
That's what we were told. So it was a process to get the wedding. My wife and I met there as undergraduates, and they had extraordinary resources and facilities for Jewish students, especially those keeping kosher, and it was really incredible, and we're so grateful to them. But when we were looking for places to get married, we couldn't find the right place. We looked at Israel, the UK, America, and then we thought about Jesus, and when we first reached out to them, they looked at some dates and they said like they don't usually do weddings, and they said unfortunately like on the dates, all the dates that you provided, the chapel is taken. So we said no worries, we don't need the chapel. uh, and Eventually we figured it out, and it ended up, according to the university's and college's historian archivist, said it was the first Jewish wedding in the college's 500, 600 year history. And it was an extraordinary fusion old Cambridge traditions and Jewish traditions, and it was a very special, intimate event with family and loved ones.
That's amazing that you were able to do something, I guess revolutionary, like in the history of the university. That's really amazing. And honestly, hopefully, other people will do it too. And maybe you started something where like they'll sort of move
We
traditions together like that.
we had a lot of funny well, it's funny to us, like needs that I don't think they'd ever encountered before. For example, we couldn't use any of they have state of the art kitchen facilities and catering, in-house catering, and like we had our own kosher caterer who had to kosher the whole place, and that whole, I think it was a massive learning curve for everyone, and thank God it all paid off at the end.
That's incredible, so that you're able to make it work. I think those kinds of things are just inspiring for people to hear. Is there anything that you'd like to say?
I think anyone who reads the book will see the similarities between the sort of historic suffering of the Iranian people and the recent, especially recent suffering of the Israeli people at the hands directly and indirectly of the Islamic Republic. And there's a lot of affinity there. And because of how dominant the Islamic Republic has been in headlines, you would assume that it's been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. But the reality is it's 46 years old, whereas Persian civilization is thousands and thousands of years old. So I think that's something that is a great takeaway, and that the book isn't available yet. It comes out on September the 25th, but it's available for pre-order now, and I can't wait for everyone to read it.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you,
and
Shifa.
I hope to see you soon.
Likewise. Thank you.